Welcome to the New Books Network.
Hello there, and welcome to New Books Network. Thanks for tuning in. I'm your host, Bernardo Batislazo, and today on the podcast we have Nick Butler discussing his book, The Trouble with Jokes, Humor and Offensiveness in Contemporary Culture and Politics, published by Bristol University Press in 2023. This book will interest anyone keen on exploring the complex interplay between humor, offensiveness, and politics in contemporary culture. Nick Butler is a professor of business administration at Stockholm University in Sweden. Nick researches the field of organizational studies, focusing on the sociology of work and critical perspectives on management. His research interests include algorithmic leadership, workplace gamification, research ethics, stand-up comedy, and the philosophy of jokes. And to be fully transparent, Nick and I met many years ago when he was a doctoral student, and we've been friends ever since. So, Nick, thank you very much for being with us today.
Thanks for having me.
Nick, let's start talking a little bit about your background and what led you to become an academic researcher.
Thanks, Bernardo. Well, my path has been a bit of a twisting one. My first degree was English literature, and then I did a master's in social and political thought. And then I did a PhD in the business school, specifically in the field of organization studies. And that's where I've been for the last 20 years or so. So that sounds like a bit of a strange journey, a meandering path, but it all hangs together somehow, specifically through a mix of sociology, philosophy, and cultural analysis that ties all the strands of my work together.
And what first piqued your interest in the dual nature of jokes in society?
Well, so I've been researching humor and comedy for about 12, 13 years now, focusing on different types of humor. And I started this research journey when I was living in Edinburgh in around 2011. And so, as you may know, Edinburgh hosts one of the world's largest arts festivals, in particular the comedy festival, collectively known as the Fringe Festival. So I was living in Edinburgh at the time. Used to go to a lot of shows. I was basically a big fan of humor, big fan of comedy, stand-up comedy, and I decided, hey, it'd be really great to research stand-up comedians. So that's what I did. That was one of the first research projects on humor. I was focusing on their work and careers specifically, but I was also interested in just the nature and structure of jokes. I find that just a fascinating topic. So that's how it all started. But this book in particular has its origins, I would say, in well, some of the events of political events of 2016 with the election of Donald Trump and also the British vote in favor of Brexit. It struck me that these political earthquakes were quite linked to humor in the civic sphere. So I think a lot of the appeal that Donald Trump cultivated was based around his use of humor, whether that was belittling, humiliating his opponents, or being a kind of mimetic figure of fun for his supporters. I think humor managed to seep its way into political discourse really prominently around this time. And that's what really made me think about writing a book. And I think I started writing the book just before Boris Johnson was elected British Prime Minister, another clownish figure who rose to the top of the political hierarchy. And that really set up the argument of the book, the way that humor functions as a political discourse, one in particular that thrives on transgression and outrage. Yeah.
And we could, of course, draw a bigger line. We will come back to that later. on how humor, particularly around the political sphere, appears in at least from for a very long time. So we could do a more of a logical analysis of that. But before that, a brief parenthesis. What advice would you share with aspiring authors who want to transform research into a book? What was your experience? What was the importance for your careers to write a book and to make a space in the business school arena where research articles are the predominant way of communicating and so on?
Well, I always wanted to write a book, so it was a personal ambition as much as a professional one, I would say. I feel I became quite good at writing articles and I wanted to challenge myself in a new way. And I wanted to write a book that used a slightly different style of writing than I had become used to with this very compact format, very limited format in many ways, with journal articles that makes particular demands on your writing style and even the content. So I wanted to write in a more expansive, free-form way. Basically, I wanted to write the kind of book that I would have loved to read. And so my advice for anyone who wants to do that is, well, if you want to write a book, just start writing. I knew I wanted to write about the relation between humor, politics, and culture, but I didn't know exactly what my argument was before I began. And I would say that I found that argument, or maybe that argument found me in the process of writing the book itself. So I would say that every book is kind of a leap of faith. You never know exactly what you're going to say, and if you're lucky, you can really surprise yourself and discover what you want to say along the way.
And thank you for that. Let's move on and talk about the book specifically. You've been living in Sweden for almost a decade now, and as a preamble to the book, what I'm going to say is that humor doesn't carry across cultures, and we even have the stereotypes of, for example, the Germans not being very funny at all. So, to what extent is the book The Trouble with Jokes limited within the Anglo-Saxon culture? Would it be something that would appeal to your a Swedish audience or a European audience or an American audience?
Yeah, definitely. So I think there's two things to say. On the one hand, humor is culturally specific, as you suggest. So jokes about, or jokes that play well in one country might not play well in another country. There are all sorts of cultural nuances involved in how humor works. On the other hand, humor in general, aside from any particular jokes or any particular content, humor in general and laughter in particular is universal. It's something shared by every culture, every country across the world. There isn't a culture that doesn't laugh, right? We might laugh at different things, but we're still united in the fact that we laugh and we tell jokes. And I would probably go further and say that humor in the political sphere is something that occurs to a greater or lesser extent in every country. And I certainly see some of the trends that I discuss in the book in the British context and US context, in also a Swedish context too. I see the same kinds of comic strategies being used by politicians in particular ways. So one recent example, well, let me backtrack a little bit and say kind of what the basic argument of the book is. So in the book, I outline some of the hidden risks of humor in civic life. Now, we tend to think of humor as usually something frivolous, something frothy, something fun, something that we maybe share among friends. If it occurs in a political sphere, it tends to enhance the charisma of the political leader. We can think about, for example, you know, a warm joke delivered by Barack Obama or some of Ronald Reagan's witty comments. These type of jokes kind of endear us to leaders and mark them out as quick-witted, magnetic in their personalities, charming, charismatic, and so on. But in the book, I'm far more interested in offensive humor and how it's used in the political sphere. So offensive humor is basically any type of humor that transgresses widely accepted social norms, that shatters our commonly held taboos, that targets our sensitivities, makes fun of the things that we hold dear. So Donald Trump would be a classic example of this, making fun, as he did in 2016, of a disabled journalist, of the parents of a war veteran, making fun of a female newscaster who he implied was menstruating. So these are taboo topics that, for example, Donald Trump makes fun of. And if we criticize any of these instances of humor, any of these jokes or comic remarks, then Donald Trump or someone like Donald Trump can say, well, hey, I'm only joking. It's just a joke. Why do you take me so seriously? You're the one who has the problem. You take yourself so seriously and you don't see the light side of life. Yeah. So this is where I think jokes are particularly interesting in the political sphere. They allow a speaker to simultaneously make a point and disavow it in the same instance. And I think that strategy is something that is widely used. And coming back to your point, we've seen that operate also in the Swedish context, particularly among the far right. The Swedish Democrats, in particular, laugh off, offensive online memes as being just joking, not really serious. Yeah. So I think that's why I wanted to look at humor and why I think my arguments apply to other countries, not just the US and the UK, even though those are the ones that I focus on in the book.
Thank you for that. It's enlightening to learn about this relationship between humor, offensiveness, and political discourse. So you go beyond a description and provide us with a framework, and you talk about different types of humor. For example, carnivalesque humor, and could you tell us a little bit more about these frameworks or these hierarchies that you are using, and where do they come from?
Yeah, well, I'm going to push back a little bit against your characterization. I don't think I'm offering any frameworks or hierarchies or structures. I like to think of the book as a kind of a freewheeling, broad range analysis of different instances of humor in society, politics, and culture. So I'm not trying to systematize and I'm not trying to establish a conceptual framework. What I am trying to do essentially is to alert us to some of the dangers of humor. And that might seem like a rather contrarian task. This might seem like something rather quixotic, because after all, humor is something that we enjoy. We like telling jokes, we like to laugh with others, and you sound like a bit of a killjoy if you want to make an argument about the political risks of telling jokes. After all, the book is called The Trouble with Jokes, right? It's not a celebration necessarily of jokes in the political sphere. And so I explore that basic argument using a range of examples in politics and culture, rather than kind of establishing a coherent framework. And why I wanted to do that in particular is I feel that the literature on humor tends to celebrate the subversive power of jokes more than it does recognize the darker sides, the danker sides of humor in the public sphere. So we find endless papers, endless books written about the potential of humor to emancipate us from oppressive structures, the ability of humor to give voice to the voiceless, to speak truth to power, to forge solidarity among marginalized groups, and so on and so forth. Yeah, we can poke fun at authoritarian leaders by using humor. We can point out the hypocrisy of public figures through the use of humor. So we find these kinds of characterizations in the academic literature on humor, and there's a lot of truth to this research, of course. But I think there is a lack of there is a reluctance, let's say, to explore the seamier sides of humor. It's almost as if there's a kind of collective agreement not to talk about the more problematic aspects of humor, such as offensive humor. But I think those are the aspects of humor that actually have the potential to influence culture and society even more than more liberal forms of humor. And so that's basically my argument. You know, what is the trouble with jokes? The trouble with jokes is that offensive, taboo-busting humor has more potential to influence political life than liberal forms of humor. That is to say, humor that respects others, humor that is in line with democratic norms, and humor that, celebrates, good old liberal values like inclusion and diversity. Illiberal humor wants to trash those values. It gains its power precisely from making fun of everything that we hold dear in liberal democracies. And I think that's why it's so dangerous too.
And therefore, what would be the role of this type of humor in a politically polarized world?
I think humor has the potential to deepen those divisions and exacerbate political polarization. I think we see this really clearly in the last two US presidential elections. And I would say in both elections, or in fact, the last three, let's go back to 2016. I think in all these elections, we can see that the far right capitalized on humor's ability to push at social norms, to push them as far as they will go and maybe beyond. Maybe we can even take the recent election. I think humor served quite different purposes on the left and the right in the US context. On the one hand, a lot of media commentators noted that Kamala Harris's campaign used a lot of funny memes and comic kind of viral imagery. We might think of Kamala Harris's brat summer, or pictures of coconuts falling off of trees, or pictures of her running mate Tim Waltz holding little piglets. You know, America's dad, this cute, funny, slightly out of touch guy. That was kind of safe, cozy humor, in line with liberal values, or at least not offensive or transgressive in any way. On the right, in Trump's campaign, we saw that humor works in a completely different way. We might think of the outrageous, yet somehow comic imagery of immigrants eating cats and dogs. Yeah, it's not really a joke, but it's so ridiculous and absurd that it becomes something that we might laugh at. Now, another example would be the online memes that characterizes Tim Waltz, Kamala Harris's running mate, Vice President Tim Waltz, as a problematic figure for the right, because he apparently passed a law that mandated sanitary products, menstrual products for boys and girls in Minnesota high schools. It was kind of semi-true, but kind of a myth. He basically mandated that schools had to provide menstrual products for people at school who needed them. But this was spun on the right as suggesting that he wanted to provide tampons in the boys' toilets. And what an absurd gesture this was. And so there are memes that went viral calling him Tampon Tim. That's an example. It's meant to raise a chuckle among people who are sympathetic to those kinds of arguments, but it's also meant to make a political point to say, well, you can't really trust this guy because he's in favor of trans rights, and trans rights just leads us down a road of absurdity. And what's more, this humor isn't simply about characterizing Tim Waltz as absurd, but it also wants to provoke a sense of disgust as well as hilarity. So in the book, I talk about how bodily humor, particularly humor concerning the lower functions of the body, urination, defecation, menstruation, and so forth, really has a powerful role to play in politics. So I think Tampon Tim is one example of bodily humor in a political context that tries to provoke these two conflicting feelings, kind of a sense of disgust or revulsion on the one hand, and a sense of hilarity on the other. And I think that can be quite powerful, but they're taboo. Yeah? They're transgressive. They're illiberal in tone and content. And I would say I'm not saying that the memes won Donald Trump re-election, but they may have certainly played a role.
Interesting. So what were your sources? What were your source material? How do you go about selecting sources and choosing them? What was the method to collect and analyze and thirdly, so it's probably a three-part question. Thirdly, where do you draw on? Do you have to draw on a particular group of people, or do you have to draw on, in terms of methods, from outside of your organizational management studies, or even within management studies there's a diversity of methods? So were there any innovations in trying to use an approach that is not commonly used? So how do you collect this evidence and analyze it, and do you have to go out and draw some innovative way or way to improve in the way that you were previously collecting and analyzing data?
Yeah, thanks, Bernardo. That's a really interesting question for me, because this book is very different to the articles that I've been writing, which is often based on qualitative research methods where I go and interview people, I collect data, I analyze the data and go through it systematically. By contrast, this book follows a far more eclectic approach. I would say that I didn't follow any particular method apart from being led by my interests and my obsessions. I use a range of philosophers to make the points I want to make. Sometimes I use them in favor of my argument, and sometimes I use them as my antagonists who I'm arguing against. And I draw on popular culture, I draw on films, TV shows, I draw on examples from the news media, real life examples, current events as they're occurring. So my method is as eclectic and as wide-ranging as you can imagine. And I would say that the book is also quite a personal book in the sense that many of the comedy shows and examples of humor I use are from my own experiences of just watching a lot of comedy on television and trying to think, how do these shine a light on the function of humor, yeah, and how do they translate into society more generally and politics in particular? So yeah, I wouldn't actually say I have a strict method with the book. except to say I'm led by my interests. Although I would say that perhaps the two most influential thinkers for me while writing this book were Sigmund Freud and Henri Bergson. I think those two philosophers, I think we can call Freud a philosopher, even though he is, of course, a psychoanalyst as well. I think they offer the most clear-sighted analysis of jokes and laughter that has rarely, if ever, been surpassed. And I think their genius lies in actually focusing on the darker sides of jokes and laughter and not letting any romantic sense of fun and frivolity get in the way of exploring the dark underbelly of comic phenomena. And that's why I was really attracted to those two thinkers who wrote their books only 5 years apart, 1900 for Bergson and 1905 for Freud. And I think those books still stand up today as among the best ever written on this topic.
That is interesting. Thank you very much. So, second to last question, what do you hope readers take away from your book, especially those unfamiliar with the history of humor, the dangers of facing humor, or the relationship between humor and identity politics?
There's a lot I would like readers to take away, but I think if I had to boil it down to one point, I would say that my aim in the book is to sensitize readers to the effects that jokes have on us when we tell them and the effect our jokes have on others when they're directed at them. I think it's a topic we don't pay too much attention to because jokes are seen as marginal or frivolous or not as serious as other types of political discourse. So a stump speech or a parliamentary debate. Jokes may appear here and there, but they're not often considered as being at the heart of political communication. And I think I would like to make a case for the importance of humor in politics and society, but also offer a warning about what humor can do, the renegade energy of humor, the outlaw character of humor. I think the problem with humor is that it presents itself as a friend while also having the ability to stab you in the back. Yeah. Shakes you by the hand, but also punches you in the gut. And I think this double-edged nature of humor is something that we should really pay attention to because it has essentially allowed wannabe despots and potential authoritarian leaders rise to prominent positions in democratic countries. And I think this is a very worrying trend indeed.
It is indeed. So my final question, what's next for you in terms of research or writing and any new projects in the pipeline that we can expect to have you back at New Books Network?
Well, I am working on a project about algorithmic leadership at the moment, which explores the development and use of digital leadership tools. These are tools that are used by managers to motivate and engage employees. And so we're interested in what they do to the leader-follower relationship, how technology, particularly AI-driven technology, intervenes in high-performance organizations. So that's more firmly based within the research that you would typically expect in a business school. I'm also continuing to write a blog on academic writing and basically encouraging people to write more stylishly, more creatively, more imaginatively within the confines of our academic research. And I hope at some point to write a book about that too.
I guess that will be very interesting, and we'll make a link to your blog in the notes. So again, thank you. Thank you to you and to our listeners for being with us today. This was Bernardo Batiz Lasso talking to Nick Butler about his book, The Trouble with Jokes. If you're new here, please subscribe. And if you're a returning listener, leave a comment in the blog.